It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Joining us is journalist and columnist Celestine Bolen, who's been teaching at Sciences Po journalism. Tough grader?
I try to be nice.
You try to be nice. Okay. Nupur Tiwari, the founder of Smashboard.org. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, François, for having me.
And we welcome back as well Richard Verley, Europe columnist for the news website Blick.
Correct.
How are things?
Well, fine. A new adventure. After so many years with Le Temps, the French language paper, I'm now moving to a German language paper, which has just started an online French language platform.
All right. This is, of course, the best of the Swiss press. Over in Brussels, Mark Burley, correspondent for the French news agency AFP, joins us. I think you have a summit coming up, Mark. Is it going to be an easy weekend?
Monday and Tuesday, even before the summit over the weekend, the EU ambassadors of all the 27 EU countries are getting together to knock heads and try and work out some sort of agreement in time for the gathering.
All right, no rest for the weary. By the way, listen and please hit like on The World This Week when it comes to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services. They're still staging funerals for the Buffalo massacre, and already the news cycle has moved on to South Texas, where using an assault rifle legally purchased the day after his 18th birthday, a teenager shot up an elementary school classroom. 19 children and 2 teachers killed.
It's the Second Amendment right to bear arms, to own guns. He was armed, so I don't know what else you could do. I think the Governor Abbott, they're going to really work on it and to where there's a tighter security.
Well, I would like to see guns taken away. I mean, no more guns. I think the only people that should have guns is our police officers and people that really know how to use them.
What is it, Celestine Bowen? We have to explain it every time. What's it with the weaponization of America? And there's more and more guns being sold.
It's crazy. And actually, when you just mentioned Buffalo, I'd already forgotten about Buffalo. Oh. You know, that's how many there are. I mean, I just was looking at a statistic. Between 1998 and 2018, the United States has had 101 or something like that shooting sprees. The next closest country was France with 8, and I think most of them were all the terrorist cases that we know so well. So it's a different story. I watched the press conference of the Texas officials, and it was just incredible how they were going out of their way to not mention really even the word gun. They were talking about mental health. They were talking about
the speed of the response now of the police officers.
Security, that came a little bit later. But I mean, just this issue, I feel is maybe not even going to make it onto the table, let alone get voted into law.
Yeah, the inaction playing out with emotional pleas at NBA basketball press conferences, on the floor of the U.S. Senate, and in the middle of a press conference by Texas Governor Greg Abbott, the Republican incumbent, interrupted by Democratic rival Beto O'Rourke.
I will pass the mic to Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick.
Excuse me. Sit down. You're out of line and an embarrassment. Sit down and don't play this stuff.
Shooting is right now, and you are doing nothing.
No, he needs to get his ass out of here. This isn't the place to talk this over.
This is totally predictable when you...
Sir, you're out of line. Sir, you are out of line. Sir, you are out of line. Please leave this auditorium.
Nupur Tiwari, your reaction to those images?
I suppose one keeps coming back to the question as to why is it that the Americans are unable to do anything about this? Why is it that particularly Americans are so addicted to gun violence? And in fact, there's a very interesting analysis that has been done by an author who's written a book called Empire of Guns. And she talks about how, we need to look at the history of gun culture in America. Why is it that Americans became so addicted to this culture? And she says that, in fact, what happened was that, once after the Revolutionary War, people had this idea that everybody should be able to own guns to not be again controlled by another tyrannical power. Except that what happened in America is that this right to protect themselves turned into a kind of tyranny, as it were. And ever since this idea of the Second Amendment sort of inspired people to say that, okay, we need to protect ourselves, things have changed, and guns have changed.
That gun culture has changed a lot in the last 20 to 30 years, Richard Verly. We're seeing as well it's now become enmeshed with this idea that they'll take your freedom away if they take your gun, which before gun rights advocates were putting the accent as well on things like gun safety and.
True, and what struck me when I was recently in the US is the level of fear. People are just afraid, those people who have guns. And they will explain to you that they have guns because they are afraid, so afraid of black people in their neighborhood, afraid of criminals, afraid of whatever. And I think that's part of the problem. America, that part of America is America who lives in fear. Fear of God knows why, because clearly it's not the fact that you own a gun that can protect you. There are many other factors, but they don't trust. They don't trust the state, they don't trust the government, they don't trust their neighbor. So this level of mistrust, how can you address it? And to me, you're talking in a title about outrage. What I find outrageous is the fact that former President Donald Trump has decided to address this NRA Congress in Houston. To me, this is an outrage. I mean, he was President of the United States. It is now a moment of grief for the country, and he despised that. And he still goes and talks to the NRA. Now, we're going to see what he says. Maybe he's going to apologize or whatever, but I doubt it. So it's very cynical to use politically such a moment.
Yeah, coincidence of the calendar, the National Rifle Association's annual convention taking place in Houston the same week as this school shooting at an elementary school. Mark Burley, and we're seeing live images of protests outside that NRA convention in Houston. Of course, in your native Australia, there was one mass shooting that ended the argument.
That sort of, it's the argument that, or it's the result that sort of punctures the argument of the NRA that, curbing gun use won't prevent this violence. It obviously has. It has in Australia. It has in Britain. We've seen it time and again. I mean, that Onion headline that keeps resurfacing every few years, why does it happen here, says the only country where it happens, sort of thing. It's, but, the one thing that sort of strikes me about it is, Europeans, Americans, we feel very, very much like we've got a lot of things in common, but this really separates us psychologically. And, at a psychological level, I think that there's a form of identity. It gives, it's mixed up with the fear that was mentioned by one of the others just a moment ago. But the idea that it gives sort of agency and power, and, it's a Hollywoodized version of themselves, of Americans in their head, where they feel like, they're individuals and they have power with guns, and it's a constitutional problem, but I think it's also a form of identity that I don't see a solution to it. But it just feels like we have this conversation every few months, every few years.
Naportawari?
Also, it's a very hyper-masculine culture of violence, which is reinforced by, contemporary culture. But also, let's not forget that gun culture also has its roots in the slave trade, That's when the British actually started selling guns everywhere, including to Americans. And then we have to go back to the roots of where this obsession for guns has come from. And I think Americans need to take a look at their history to see how guns were used for trade, for disciplining, for killing. There is a certain history also to this culture that needs to be interrogated.
The history is there, Celestine Bullen, but again, it's the ratcheting up in the last 10 to 20 years. And this idea that freedom is associated with guns. And we talked with the Buffalo shooting about this idea of replacement theory being touted by white supremacists. Is this idea that if you don't have a gun, they're going to somehow replace you? Is that taking it a stretch
I don't know
too far?
that it. I mean, I agree completely about the fear, and I agree also that that the country is so divided, and this has become one of the issues that is dividing. And the more it divides, the more each camp gets, sort of refers only to itself. It has echoes in terms of, the West, in terms of my home is my castle. It has echoes in terms of protecting against another alien or, groups that people don't know or fear. So, I feel it's like so ingrained for all the reasons you were saying that it's very hard to pull it out also in the context of a highly polarized country where if somebody says we're going to regulate your guns, it's interpreted as take away your guns. I mean, I know people, who are Democrats who try to get, people to understand that there are hunters, that that it's not everybody who has a gun is is an evil person. I mean, there is a cultural divide here. That,
but it's become a partisan issue. While the United States liberally sells weapons of war over the counter, Ukraine is pleading for all the military hardware it can get. As the world marked 90 days of war this week, it was the eastern city of Severodonetsk that emerged as what some are calling the new Mariupol, surrounded on three sides. Ukrainian forces now enduring a daily pounding while Russian forces shell the country's second city, Kharkiv, at a distance. And, a week ago, Richard Verly, the narrative was that the pendulum has swung against Russia. Now, not so much.
Not surprising. If you talk, and I was exchanging with military experts, all of them were saying there will be a second time in this war. At first, clearly, Russia was not beaten, but not achieving its goal. And the human losses on the Russian side was by far much more heavier than they were expected. But the reality is they have brought in reinforcement. They have taken the lesson from the first stage of the war, and they are now using a clear strategy of wiping out the cities. Distance-wise, artillery, not involving troops directly. Troops are coming afterwards. So we are now seeing what we could have seen at the beginning. So Russia may not have been as well prepared as we thought for the offensive on Ukraine, but now they have learned, and now they are coming big time. And now Ukraine is really facing the challenge. And what Zelensky and all the Ukraine officials are saying is true. That is probably the most daring challenge coming in these weeks.
Yeah, so throughout the war, the European Union, Ukraine's allies, maintaining a united front ahead of next Monday's EU summit. It's now got a holdout, Viktor Orban's Hungary, which gets its oil by pipeline from Russia. He's so far refusing to sign off on an oil embargo. Some of that oil transits through Ukraine, and that's got Kyiv issuing veiled threats.
How many more weeks will it take for the European Union to agree on its sixth package of sanctions, when Russia receives almost €1 billion a day from energy exports to Europe? Of course, I'm grateful to those friends who are advocating new sanctions. But where do the people blocking this sixth package get their power from? Why are they still allowed to have so much power?
Mark Burley, do you see Ukraine cutting off the Russian oil that's flowing through its territory to Hungary?
Well, it's hard to know what will happen in times of war, but I can say that, you mentioned at the start of the program another summit happening next week. It feels like we have one of these every 2 or 3 weeks now. So this is an extraordinary summit on Monday and Tuesday, and it's all about Ukraine. It's about the energy crisis. It's about Europe pulling together, becoming more of a having more of a military-industrial complex to be able to face this and other crises in the future.
And how much of it's about Hungary?
Being talked about. Well, exactly. Not officially on the agenda, it's not about Hungary, but that's because Viktor Orban earlier this week sent a letter saying, don't discuss an oil ban. We're not going to go there. I'm not going to take part in the conversation. Now, behind the scenes, the EU diplomats are furiously working on it. And I guess they're trying to work out how much of this is Hungary asking for money, basically. It's been frozen out of coronavirus recovery funds because of rule of law issues. So it may be a question about money, or it may be a solid question that Viktor Orban, who has seen Putin and is seen as more sympathetic to Moscow than any other leader in the EU. It may be that this is really, as he says, a red line. The diplomats are looking at some other possible solutions, talking through them. They're not accepted by all the diplomats, but something like maybe cutting out pipeline oil from this sanctions package. This sanctions package was announced on the 4th of May. What's that, about 3 weeks ago by Ursula von der Leyen, like it was almost a done thing. And 3 weeks later, there's still, it's hit a brick wall because of Hungary. And we'll have to see over the weekend and particularly on Monday if there's any movement. There's not a lot of optimism on that.
Has the tide turned against Ukraine? Has the tide turned against the European Union, Celestine?
I think if we're talking about the tide of war, I think, to be honest, that last week kind of optimism was probably overplayed, and I think that the Ukrainians, I think we can all agree, have definitely won the television war. They've won the propaganda war. And sometimes they dictate the way, they don't dictate, but they show a way in which we follow in terms of coverage. And I think the fact of the matter is, as was just said, the Russian counterattack was long foreseen. We know how they operate. We know they like to go in with all guns blazing. Talk about guns in the far west, but they go in and they break everything that they see. And so, I have to say this is a super troubling time. I think back to 2014 when the Ukrainian army was caught in a trap and isolated, and the Russians walked away with a kind of a ceasefire that happened at a moment when Ukraine was weaker, and I worry that they're going to be encircled again. I'm not a military person, so I don't know. But in terms of the European Union, I have a question almost more than an answer, which is, why announce this huge ambitious sanction package if they didn't have all their ducks lined up in the row? We could have foreseen, talks with Orban might have revealed this. I think it's more the way it looks.
Yeah, there's a mix of ideology and horse trading that's taking place.
And you do the horse trading first, and then you announce. That seems to me
Nupur Tiwari.
Well, as someone who comes from the global south, I look at things a little differently. Like when we are talking about sanctions, I'm really thinking about, putting sanctions even on Russia. I really think about the people who are living there and how many innocent lives are put at risk when we use this sanction technique, to resolve wars, as it were. And what I find interesting in this situation is that, of course, Russia's acts of violence are reprehensible. But at the same time, I think there is a certain frustration right now in the EU as well as in America, in the United States, that the global south is actually not going out and out against Russia unequivocally, and that is kind of tipping the balance.
So what's the feeling when the EU nations are still paying for their Russia for their natural gas and oil, while Russia blockades the export of wheat and other grains for the developing world?
Well, it's a war, if you look at the way the global north has been, sponsoring wars, as it were, in other parts of the country. Look at Yemen, for example. There is hunger in Yemen. They have had a war for the last 8 years. We're not talking about them. Right now, we are talking about only Ukraine. But let's also talk about, EU's role in this war. The Italian weapons that are being sold, that are being seen in Yemen. France, which is continuing to sell military equipment to Saudi Arabia. And there is hunger in these parts that is also very present and has been encouraged by the global north. So I feel that in these discussions and these analyses that we have about wars, there are two things that we must remember. One is that, Russia's warring is somehow not more ideologically reprehensible than what the global north has been doing in the rest of the world for many, many years. When there was shelling in Afghanistan and children died there, those children were just as dead as the children that are dying in Ukraine today are.
But two wrongs don't make a right.
They don't. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge and come face to face with the way we are dealing with land and people as just things to be dominated over and taken over with brutal violence. There's that. And there's also, I feel, something that we need to bring into our mainstream conversations about war, which is that people who are already ravaged by violence in peacetime right now, in Ukraine, but also elsewhere, are the ones who are suffering the most. Women, trans people, disabled people, they are people who are going to live with this continuum of violence for many, many years, and we are not going to be thinking of those solutions at all. We are not even considering it a problem and putting on this table of our discussion.
Very briefly on this point, Mark Burley, at the EU, how much are people talking about this, about winning the argument when it comes to the rest of the world?
I think it's well and truly recognized that there isn't global support. Russia isn't as isolated as perhaps some Western media would like to believe. But you've got to remember that, as horrible as violence, as war is around the world, this is in Ukraine, which shares a border with the European Union. And the European Union, which was set up as a post-World War II peace project. But, before this, and if you kind of ignored Bosnia, they were saying that this brought peace on the continent for 70 years. Now, this is blowing apart that sort of legend building, and this shows why the attention of the European Union is very much focused more on Ukraine, perhaps, than on Yemen or Afghanistan, although there are things going on there as well. And why we're largely seeing... Despite their own participation, this is a shared border issue. And this is also, if you look, if it comes down to direct borders, you've got the border of the European Union shared with Ukraine, which certainly directs minds and attention here in Brussels. But it's also because of the shared border, Russia with Ukraine, that Russia is able to maintain this assault and gain ground along the part of the border that it's basically got a beachhead. It can move in there effectively unopposed into the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk that it held before this war broke open in such a wide scope. So, we can see that it's a Western versus Russia thing. The point is taken that it's the global South. Brazil's not part of this. India's not part of this. China is effectively looking for an opportunity on pro-Russian. Russia's not isolated, but that in terms of principal values in your near neighborhood, on your border, this is what perhaps makes what's happening here, more of a priority for what's happening with
and on
European
that point,
countries.
We heard addressing his first Davos World Economic Forum as German Chancellor Olaf Scholz on Thursday, proceeding, as always, with caution, with two different messages.
Putin will only seriously negotiate peace when he realizes that he cannot break Ukraine's defenses. That's why we support Ukraine. We're not doing anything that would make NATO a party in the war, because that would mean direct confrontation between nuclear powers.
So, Richard Verley, can imagine what the reactions are in Kyiv to that.
Well, to tell you the truth, I have a problem with this global South versus global North. I really have a problem with that, because that's fitting exactly Putin into Putin argument. That's what he wants to hear. That's what he wants to propagate. Now I have a question to our Indian friends. Imagine that China is attacking India tomorrow and wanting to take two provinces or two regions of India. What should we do? What should we do? Then should we let the global South deal with its problem? Don't forget, Russia has attacked Ukraine, and by attacking Ukraine, it is threatening democracy and the European Union. The European Union is reacting with sanctions to protect its interest. So maybe some other countries are affected, okay, but the European Union is absolutely entitled to defend its interest with commercial sanctions.
Entitled is a very, very good term, because I feel that the global north
there is no such thing as global north.
Entitled. Oh, there is.
No.
Because we are affected by its policies. So I feel that entitlement is a very good word, because Europe and the US feel entitled that the rest of the world should support them in whatever it is, whatever bloc that they are opposing.
Right. European Union is taking sanctions to defend itself. European Union doesn't have to defend India.
We cannot have these conversations without admitting that this whole culture of war that we have today, this whole situation that we are in, these conflicts are created and have been created by European and US policies.
No.
If we do not accept them,
I mean, I think
then we
the
are
history of the world is
absolute disagreement.
Then our foreign analysis is
absolute disagreement.
Is actually racist, because we live in a world that is not equal.
First of all, I mean, I think the world history shows there are plenty of wars that had nothing to do with Europe.
Oh, but there are plenty in the recent past
many were, and then there are many that are between India and Pakistan, and there are many that between China and India, in which the U.S. or the Europeans had nothing to say. I mean, I'm just thinking. I think that the world order that we worry about is already before us. The fact that India, given the situation with lack of wheat, I mean, the shortages of wheat, et cetera, India has decided not to export anymore. That's fine. We understand that, but that's exactly what all sorts of countries are doing, looking at their own interests as well as
everybody looks at their own interests.
Right.
I agree with that. I'm not even saying that war is a solution, or what Russia is doing in Ukraine has anybody's approval, especially not mine. But what I'm saying is that we have to look at the way global conflict is created and maintained by the global.
But when you hear Germany's chancellor, just very briefly on this, Nupur,
the weapons that are being sold right now in Yemen, the weapons that are being sold to India, we are buying them.
Yeah, you're
but
buying
they are being
Russian
made
weapons,
in France.
which is why you don't
they're
want
being
to say
made. But it's the weapon manufacturers that are actually sustaining.
But I mean, every
Let's
country
get to the
is
brass tacks
pursuing
sometimes, and also admit that the global north does have a role in sponsoring, maintaining war, selling arms to countries that really need to spend that money elsewhere.
But you heard that the clip there of the German chancellor saying, we don't want to go to war. We don't want to be dragged into a war.
Right. Of course, Europe doesn't want to be dragged into a war. Who wants to be dragged into a war? Does India want to be dragged into a war? Did the Afghanis say, please come and bomb us? No, nobody wants to be in a war. And yes,
well, the fact that we're having such a heated conversation here shows the failure of the UN Security Council to take up its role of ensuring, of protecting
also because the UN
peace
thus
and
far
security.
has been a post-World War II, institution, as it were, that where America, the US, and Eurocentrism rule. Now we are looking at a world where this unipolarity is shifting, and that is why this
let's take this global now then. Right. Olaf Scholz on message in Davos, Joe Biden perhaps off script in Tokyo.
We stand firmly with Japan and with other nations not to let that happen. And my expectation is it will not happen.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
You are?
That's the commitment we made.
Celestine Bowen, because we've had what we thought were gaffes by Biden, but actually turned out to be pretty pointed when it came to Russia.
Right.
In this case, is that a gaffe?
I mean, I don't know. I feel I'm not a great Sino expert. I do feel as though, part of the point of his trip and part of the point of the Quad and all this is to lay down markers for China to understand. And I think, the things that I've read about what we should do with Taiwan is be clear, so that everybody knows if China does X, this will be the reaction on the other side. Was the choice of words wise? Probably not. He seems to have a habit of not saying this a bit too bluntly, or maybe even not meaning to say what he says. But I think in terms of clarity, I think maybe it's a good thing.
And it's more than just the South China Sea. It looks like a scramble for the Pacific that's brewing. China's foreign minister, Wang Yi, landing in Kiribati this Friday. That's a sprawling group of islands looking for new friends. Kiribati in the neighborhood of everywhere from Hawaii to the north and French Polynesia to the east to New Zealand's Cook Islands. And the Solomon Islands, which recently concluded a new cooperation pact with Beijing, the Solomon Islands, Wang's first stop on his tour.
The mutual trust between our two countries is getting stronger, with more common interest and even wider cooperation. It's fair to say that the ties between China and the Solomon Islands have set the pace in China's relations with Pacific Island countries.
Mark Burley, your reaction?
Strategically, it makes a lot of sense for China to be pushing eastwards in the Pacific. It's got a lot of these freedom of navigation movements by particularly the United States and its allies through waters that it claims to try and push this back as it is growing as a naval power, steadily. It makes a lot of strategic sense for this to happen. I know Australia is very unhappy with the Solomon Islands deal that's going down and is off. I believe the new foreign minister, Penny Wong, is flying around the Pacific trying to show that Australia still cares about the Pacific and, is, I guess, transmitting a bit of the American alliance out that way. But it's a bit hard to confront China when it's got a mind set on something and it's putting its economic and developing military might behind it. Strategically, it makes sense for China what it's doing.
What are your thoughts? I mean, the optics of, we saw that summit in Tokyo that brought together the leaders of the U.S., Japan, Australia, the new prime minister there mentioned by Mark Burley, and India's prime minister, the Quad as it's called.
Yes, I think it's interesting that the Quad is suddenly being revived, and I think partially that could be because the Pacific, as it were, wasn't really considered as an area of strategic interest for China, at least some years ago. And now all of a sudden it is. So there is this sense of insecurity, obviously. And I think what Mr. Biden wants to obviously do is that, given that China is increasingly being seen as a power that can supplant the US, as it were, there is a lot of growing mistrust, there is a lot of growing tension. And that might not, after all, have been a gaffe, right? Because there has to be some amount of diplomacy, some amount of saber rattling that has to constantly happen, because China has all of a sudden stopped being this place where cheap things can be manufactured, right? It's being increasingly seen as a threat by America. And this is what I was saying just before we went to hear what Mr. Biden was saying, is that the unilateral, sort of like the single control, the hegemony that the US has is getting shattered. And these, Quad is really merely an attempt to find allies that can counter that power that US feels is threatening it as China grows.
Richard Verly?
Difficulty for Biden is US is fighting on two fronts. Though it is not a war, an open war with Russia, the military challenge posed by Russia in Ukraine, plus the challenge posed by China, is making
you got the sense Ukraine was kind of the subtext when Biden was talking about Taiwan.
I do, and I think at the moment those in the mindset of the U.S. administration, those two subjects are linked. By facing Russia in Ukraine, by providing Ukraine with a lot of weaponry, the U.S. is actually trying to teach a lesson to China. Now, will it work or not? Then we're coming back to the present Russian offensive. It's very clear that if Russia managed to win in the coming weeks, that will be difficult to handle for Biden, especially before the midterm election.
And Mark Burley, with Nipur mentioning there the fact that this is a U.S.-led club, the Quad, and that's fact. I mean, how is that viewed by Australians?
Well, I don't know if I've forgot the sound. I think that what's interesting with the Quad, Well, actually, what's really interesting for me as an Australian is, we've got a new government and a new Prime Minister who looks to be putting aside the acrimony that had built up with France over AUKUS, which is, all about a defence alliance in the Pacific. France was
there was even a phone call on Thursday between Anthony Albanese and Emmanuel Macron.
Indeed, yeah, and last information I've seen is, we don't have the text messages that were released under the previous Prime Minister or anything to know what the conversation is, but we can see that there are efforts being made to really form some sort of closer relationship. And I could imagine that, Macron, in the time that's left for Biden, because we've got to remember the clock is ticking down there under the Biden administration with a possible Trump administration coming back. So I can imagine Macron strategically might use this as an opportunity. 2 years, but with midterms, we all know about lame duck presidents. Time, we're definitely feeling like the time is ticking on this Western alliance.
Well.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just in case we were looking for good news, we've... I think I don't know enough about Australian politics. I'd be curious to hear, but I do feel that this new Prime Minister, certainly the few Australians I know seem to say that it was time to get rid of the other one, and this one is coming in, and he certainly went to work right away. The schedule dictated that because of the Quad meeting, but, he seems like he kind of came, shooting out of the garage, and, his foreign minister is making tours, and, all of a sudden it's sort of like Australia is there wants to make itself known, and I'm not surprised that it's trying to sort of rebuild bridges to France after that disaster, which was
the scuttled submarine deal,
which was terrible, and and sort of prove itself a trustworthy ally to the U.S. That seems like a message he's managed to get across in less than a week, right?
Just a word on that submarine deal. Clearly, France welcomed this new prime minister election in Australia, but he won't back down on the submarine deal, especially not in this situation. Australia will stick more than ever to the US.
Right. Well, at the end of the day, France, anyway, it is about the nuclear-powered submarines, which you could get.
Indeed it is. Only yes means
American
yes.
American submarines that Australia won't see for maybe 10, 15, 20 years. China's acting now, so tactically something has to be put in place before then.
That's a good point.
So they're going to rent French submarine? That's what you mean, Mark?
I think France was more than willing to put nuclear engines in those things. Let's see what
I heard
happens.
not. I've never understood that they would
French
not.
wares always come with a heavy price tag.
That's right. We could talk about Rafale jets sold to India another time. Only yes means yes. That's the name of the bill adopted Thursday by Spain's parliament. The measure to qualify non-consensual sex as rape is the direct follow-up of the 2016 case. 5 men at the time who were convicted of sexual abuse during Pamplona's running of the bulls, but not rape because their victim was too frozen with fear to say no.
Today is a very important day for women in our country. The only yes is yes. The sister I do believe in you finally turns into a law. Sexual freedom will finally become a right in our country, and we're going to change violence for freedom. And we're going to change fear for desire. From today onwards, Spain is a country with more freedom and a country safer for all women.
We're going to change fear for desire. They didn't call the bill no means no. They called the bill only yes means yes. Your thoughts on that, Nupur Tiwari?
Well, I think any legislation, any country that moves towards defining, to a definition of rape which is based on consent, that you have to laud it, you have to encourage it. Because today, even in France, the definition of rape in law is actually very archaic. It's not a consent-based definition, and that's really, it's very bizarre that a country should have should put emphasis on rape only as something that can be done under coercion. In fact, French law states that it's rape only if it's done under violence, constraint, threat, or surprise. There is no mention of consent, and it's very, very important to move to a definition of rape that is consent-based, which does not mean that things will automatically change, because in India we do have a definition of rape that is consent-based. That doesn't mean that everything is going to change. But it is extremely important that we start believing women, because despite the fact, for example, in France, there are 1 in 2 women who have faced sexual violence in their lives, we still tend to not believe women and keep getting in the question of, maybe the man is innocent, the presumption of innocence. We insist so much on it, but we do not insist on the fact that if there are 1 in 2 women who have faced sexual violence in France today, and if there's many as, 95,000 women who have said that they have either been raped or there has been an attempt of rape against them, then we also have to think that there are men around who are actually perpetrating this violence, but we don't want to ever believe that.
Yeah, and that brings us straight to what's been sucking the oxygen in French politics this week, the argument that's been revived over what Nupur was describing. It's those who talk about the presumption of innocence versus those who talk about the presumption of truth. The freshly appointed Minister for Disabilities, Damien Abad, categorically denying the rape of 2 women 8 years ago. Their allegations flagged by a rights group. One did lodge a complaint in 2017, not the other. And authorities saying, look, we can't prosecute unless there's a formal complaint. And this idea, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
Presumption of truth presumption of innocence.
Presumption of truth on the part of the women, yes, although, if we're not hearing this in a court of law, it's hard to, we're here reading it in sort of certain newspapers that are giving the details of what these women say happened. I mean, what worries me, and I'm interested in the conversation, is only yes means yes, but the problem is it still comes down to one person's word against another. I mean, even the consent can be, she said yes, he said, and then she says didn't hear me when I said yes, and
but even if you can't legally,
when I said no,
if you can't legally prove it with the legislation in Spain, does that not then sort of change the mindset?
I don't know. I worry that, again, it's a he said, she said thing. But anyway, to get to the point of Abad, I think the problem here is, as you say, political. I mean, it's all about a new government, which should have been, above any suspicion, a new prime minister who should have had a chance to, apparently she only learned about it after the naming of the ministers. So, I feel like here, to take the sexual allegations out of it, it's a political trust issue.
That's the problem.
No, I agree.
Because we are living in a rape culture. We cannot say it's just a simple he said, she said. In fact, I feel that France's political culture is a rape culture. The message that Mr. Emmanuel Macron is sending again and again to the women who have faced sexual violence by bringing in people like Darmanin, by bringing in people like Abad, or even Dupont-Moretti, for that matter, the message
he's not accused of any sexual misdeeds.
He isn't, but
I miss something?
But yeah, but he is. He does have a record. But anyway, let me just finish what I'm saying. So I'm saying the message that Mr. Emmanuel Macron is sending out to French women is that the violence that they have faced, their trauma, their pain, are not important. By repeatedly nominating people who have been accused of rape, this is the message that he's sending out to the women, and specifically to the women who have accused Abad or Darmanin. He's basically saying that you are lying, because the problem is that even women are not able to recognize that we are living in a rape culture. There are statistics. I would request you as a woman to actually look up the statistics that are available on France and on the violence and the endemic violence that is present
just very briefly,
in France.
Because we're running short on time. Richard Verly, how much of a problem is this for Emmanuel Macron, especially because, as Celestine was saying, it undermines his newly appointed prime minister?
Clearly, but you can see it another way around. You can say that actually he's betting on justice, and he considers that a case is in the end of the judge, and the judges have to decide as far as Abbott is concerned. Now, the problem, I believe, politically, the problem is that Abbott is social affairs minister. It's more than disability minister, social affairs minister. That's a portfolio which will be very difficult to handle when you are yourself accused of having abused someone. So that's, I think, there lies the political problem for, I'm only talking about the political problem, lies an important political problem for Emmanuel Macron.
And unfortunately, we're out of time.
Okay.
I wish we had more, because there's a lot more to say on this story, which, according to Richard Verly, will run. I want to thank Mark Burley for joining us from Brussels. I want to thank Celestine Boland, Richard Verly, Nupur Tiwari. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.
Thank you, François.